From the outside, the city of Berkeley, California, looked like any other progressive, bustling college town. Streets lined with coffee shops, bookstores, and organic markets, people moving about their daily lives, students rushing to classes, neighbors walking their dogs along shaded sidewalks. But beneath the familiar hum of urban life, an unsettling story was about to unfold, one that would grip not just the local community, but people across the nation. The story begins with her. She wasn't a celebrity, she wasn't famous. She was just an ordinary woman with an ordinary life, the kind of person who could easily be your neighbor, your coworker, your friend. Her name, her age, her background, those details vary depending on which outlet you read, because in stories like this, the focus too often shifts from who she was to what happened to her. But for those who knew her, she was a vibrant, dependable presence. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who volunteered to bring food to community events, who always waved hello when you passed her on the street. And then, one day, she was gone. At first, it didn't seem alarming. People get busy, they travel, they turn off their phones for a while. But as the hours stretched into days, unease began to creep in. Friends sent unanswered texts. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. She missed work without calling in. For someone so responsible, so grounded in routine, this was unlike her. Her family reported her missing. The police in Berkeley launched what seemed like a standard investigation at first. They checked her phone records. They retraced her last known steps. Neighbors remembered seeing her on an ordinary afternoon, carrying groceries, greeting a passerby, nothing out of place. It was as though she had simply vanished into thin air. But we all know people don't just vanish. Not really. Flyers appeared on lampposts and bulletin boards. Her photograph, smiling, bright, hopeful, stared back from every street corner. Local news stations aired the story. Missing woman in Berkeley, family pleads for answers. The community rallied. Volunteers formed search parties, combing through parks, alleyways, trails near the Berkeley Hills. Police officers knocked on doors, asking questions. Did anyone see her after Tuesday night? Did anyone hear anything unusual? Was there a car parked where it shouldn't have been? And still nothing. Weeks passed. For her family, time dragged like a nightmare that refused to end. Every phone call, every knock at the door, brought a jolt of hope. Maybe news had come. But each time, disappointment followed. She was still gone. Then the rumors started. Some said she had run away. Others whispered about secret relationships, debts, personal struggles. But her closest friends pushed back. That wasn't her. She wasn't the type to vanish without a word, without explanation. She was responsible, thoughtful, steady. Something had happened. Something darker than anyone wanted to admit. The case deepened when detectives traced her last known movements to Vallejo, a city just 25 miles away, known for its complex mix of industrial history and suburban life. Why was she there? Who had she been meeting? Leads emerged, but each one fizzled. A reported sighting in a grocery store. A phone ping that turned out to be a dead end. A neighbor who thought they heard something suspicious late at night. All of it pointed nowhere. But then, a new detail surfaced, one that would turn the case in a shocking direction. Police received a tip about a property in Vallejo, a rundown house on a quiet street. To most, it looked like just another neglected building, the kind of place you barely notice driving by. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeled in strips, old furniture sat rotting on the porch. Neighbors described the house as strange, unsettling. They said the man who lived there kept to himself, rarely speaking, often seen hauling strange bags into the property late at night. It was known in whispers as the Hoarder house. Authorities decided to check it out, if only to rule it out. But what they would eventually find there was far beyond anyone's imagination. For the missing woman's family, every day without answers felt unbearable. They gathered together, clinging to hope even as fear gnawed at the edges. They prayed she was alive somewhere, waiting to be found. For the community, the disappearance had grown into something bigger than a single person's tragedy. It was a reminder of how quickly normal life could fracture, how the familiar streets of your hometown could hide the darkest secrets. And for investigators, the pressure mounted. They knew the longer a person remained missing, the smaller the chances of finding them alive. Time wasn't on their side. But as the investigation steered toward Vallejo, toward that crumbling house with its locked doors and drawn curtains, no one yet realized that the missing woman's story wasn't about to end with her being found alive. It was about to take a chilling turn. Because behind those walls, behind the piles of debris and clutter, behind the facade of neglect and secrecy, the truth waited hidden, horrifying, and irreversible. The disappearance quickly turned into more than just a local story. Berkeley wasn't used to cases like this, at least not ones that dragged on with no answers. When a person goes missing in broad daylight, without witnesses, without clear evidence, the entire community feels it. It seeps into conversations at coffee shops, classrooms, workplaces. Everyone starts asking the same question: how could someone just vanish here? For the woman's family, the waiting was torture. They called the police station daily, desperate for updates. They organized search parties, pinning maps to the kitchen wall, marking areas that had already been covered, circling neighborhoods that still needed volunteers. Friends showed up with flashlights, water bottles, and sneakers, ready to walk miles in the California sun. And slowly, the city of Berkeley transformed into something else, a place defined not by its university or activism, but by the haunting face on every missing person flyer taped to every light pole. The police doubled their efforts. Dogs were brought in to trace scents. Helicopters scanned the hills. Detectives re-interviewed neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances. Everyone who had seen her in the days before her disappearance was asked the same questions, over and over. What was her mood like? Did she seem worried? Did she mention meeting anyone? But every answer led nowhere. At one point, a lead came in. A woman claimed to have seen her at a gas station outside of Oakland. Excited, officers reviewed security footage. But the figure on screen wasn't her. Just another dead end. Another tip suggested she'd been spotted boarding a bus. Again, detectives checked. It wasn't true. And with each false lead, frustration grew. The case began to weigh heavily on the detectives assigned to it. They knew the statistics. They knew that every day without answers lowered the chance of bringing her home safely. But still, they pressed forward. Then came Vallejo. A tip landed on the desk of one investigator, almost overlooked at first. It was from a neighbor in Vallejo who had noticed strange things at a rundown property on their street. They described a house that seemed abandoned and yet wasn't. Lights would flicker on at odd hours. A man, reclusive and erratic, was seen carrying heavy bags into the home late at night. The smell coming from the property was foul, sharp, almost chemical. At first, it sounded like the typical strange neighbor complaint. But investigators couldn't ignore it. When someone disappears without explanation, every detail matters, even the bizarre ones. So officers drove out to Vallejo. The house stood at the end of a quiet street. To anyone else, it was just another neglected property, paint peeling, windows covered, weeds choking the yard. But up close, the signs were unmistakable. Newspapers and trash piled high near the door. Rusted bikes and broken furniture stacked in the yard. The porch sagged under the weight of forgotten objects. It was, in every sense, a hoarder's house. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering as police cars pulled up. Some admitted they had always found the property unsettling. Kids dared each other to walk past it at night. Adults avoided it altogether. One neighbor swore they heard noises inside at odd hours, not just the shuffling of junk, but cries. Others dismissed it as imagination. But the tip was enough to keep investigators interested. At first, they tried knocking. No answer. The man who lived there, the prime occupant, was nowhere to be seen. But the stench drifting from the house was undeniable. Even from the porch, officers could smell decay. It was then that suspicion sharpened. They couldn't yet enter without a warrant, but they could watch. Surveillance was set up. Officers monitored the house, waiting to see who came and went. Days passed. The man finally appeared, shuffling out in ragged clothes, carrying bags to his car. They followed. What they learned disturbed them further. The man had a history. Records showed prior arrests, minor offenses, nothing violent on paper, but enough to raise questions. Neighbors described him as off, unpredictable, sometimes hostile. He lived alone, never welcomed visitors, and rarely spoke to anyone. And when the woman's disappearance timeline was compared with his movements, something clicked. She had last been seen heading in the direction of Vallejo. And his house? It was right along that path. The more detectives dug, the less this looked like coincidence. They filed for a search warrant. The paperwork crawled through the legal system as officers built their case: the smell, the suspicious activity, the man's record, the tip from neighbors. Finally, a judge signed off. And so, on a cloudy morning, officers returned to Vallejo. Search teams gathered, gloves on, flashlights ready. The neighbors watched anxiously from their windows. The Hoarder house, with its broken windows and collapsing porch, would finally give up its secrets. Inside, what investigators found first was chaos. Mountains of trash filled every room. Old newspapers, plastic bags, rotting food, broken electronics. Hallways so clogged with clutter that officers had to squeeze sideways to get through. The air was thick with mold, dust, and something far more sinister. One detective later described it as walking into a nightmare. At that point, no one could yet confirm what had happened. The missing woman's name hadn't been spoken inside that house. But every instinct told investigators they were close. Too close. And in the coming hours, their suspicions would be confirmed in the most chilling way imaginable. When investigators stepped into the Vallejo property, it felt less like entering a home and more like stepping into another world, a claustrophobic, unsettling maze. Every inch of space was swallowed by junk. Floor to ceiling, the walls bowed under the weight of objects stacked haphazardly, creating narrow, twisting paths through mountains of clutter. It wasn't just trash. It was an obsession. Decades worth of magazines, broken appliances, clothes soiled with age, moldy furniture, rusted tools, cracked dishes, everything that should have been thrown away long ago. And then there was the smell. Rot. Decay. Something worse than garbage. A stench that settled into your clothes, clung to your skin, filled your lungs until it was impossible to breathe normally. Officers exchanged uneasy glances as they pressed forward. Neighbors had long wondered what went on inside. Some remembered seeing the man who lived there, gaunt, hunched, eyes darting nervously as if he was always hiding something. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was curt, dismissive, almost hostile. "I told my kids never to trick-or-treat at that house," one neighbor later said. It always felt wrong. Like there were secrets in there nobody should see. Another neighbor recalled hearing strange sounds at night. At first, she thought it was just rats or raccoons. But sometimes, it sounded like muffled voices. She told herself she was imagining it until the day the police arrived. Inside, detectives pushed deeper into the labyrinth. Every step revealed more filth, more chaos. It was hard to believe anyone could live here. The electricity still worked, but barely. Cords snaked across the floor, tangled and frayed, powering old lamps that flickered weakly. Dirty mattresses were stacked in corners, covered with stains. Piles of canned food sat expired by decades. But then came something stranger. Behind the heaps of trash, certain sections of the house seemed deliberate. Walls that didn't line up quite right. Spaces that felt narrower than they should. One officer, experienced in crime scenes, immediately noticed it. "Something's off," he muttered, running his flashlight beam across a section of drywall. It looked newer than the rest. While most of the house's walls were stained, cracked, and warped with age, this one looked oddly patched, cleaner and smoother, as though it had been built more recently. They knocked. The hollow sound echoed differently. That's when their stomachs sank. It wasn't just a wall. It was hiding something. The officers called it in, marking the spot. Tools were brought in to cut through the makeshift construction. And with each strike, the smell grew stronger. Neighbors, watching from outside, had no idea what was unfolding inside. But they could see the officers' faces as they carried equipment in, hear the muffled thuds as the false wall was torn down. A tense silence hung in the air. Hours passed. Then whispers began to circulate. Something had been found. Though details weren't immediately released, the mood shifted. Reporters gathered at the barricade. Camera crews set up, their lights cutting through the dim evening. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering anxiously. Everyone sensed it. This was no longer a missing person case. This was something darker. Behind that false wall, investigators uncovered the horrifying answer to a family's worst nightmare. There, hidden within the Hoarder's chaos, lay the remains of the missing woman. The discovery sent shockwaves through Berkeley and Vallejo. For weeks, her face had been on every flyer, every news broadcast. People prayed she would be found alive. Instead, she had been right there all along, concealed in a secret chamber of a house that neighbors had always felt uneasy about but never could have imagined hiding something so sinister. The police sealed off the property, treating it as a full crime scene. Evidence markers were placed. Photographs taken. Every piece of junk was examined for potential clues. As the news broke, reporters scrambled to release headlines. Missing Berkeley woman found dead in Vallejo house. Crowds gathered near the property, their faces pale with disbelief. How could this have happened here? For the family, the confirmation was devastating. Their desperate hope shattered into grief. They had imagined so many scenarios, but this was beyond comprehension. Detectives immediately turned their attention to the man who lived there. He wasn't home when the discovery was made, but his history, his behavior, his reclusive nature, it all pointed to him. This wasn't a random accident. This was calculated concealment. The false wall wasn't just clutter. It was deliberate construction. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide what was inside. Now, investigators had more than just a disappearance. They had a crime, a homicide, and a suspect. That night, the Vallejo property glowed under harsh floodlights as forensics teams worked tirelessly. Every piece of evidence mattered. DNA samples were collected, fingerprints lifted, measurements taken of the secret room. The woman's remains were carefully removed, transported with solemn respect. The neighbors stood outside in stunned silence. Some wept. Others clutched their children tighter. The rumors about the strange house had never prepared them for this. "It makes me sick," one man said. "All this time, she was right there. We walked past that house every day. We joked about it being creepy. But none of us thought it was hiding something like this." The community's fear deepened. If something this horrific could happen behind closed doors, what else was hidden in plain sight? For detectives, the pressure shifted. Finding her was only the beginning. Now they had to build the case, to prove beyond doubt who was responsible and why. And the man who lived there? He had just gone from strange neighbor to prime suspect. The morning after the grim discovery, Vallejo was buzzing. The quiet, overlooked town had suddenly become the center of a national news storm. Helicopters hovered above. Reporters camped outside the barricaded street. Neighbors who had once whispered about the strange man in the Hoarder house now found themselves interviewed on live television. But behind all the chaos, detectives had only one name on their minds: the man who lived there. He was no longer just the reclusive neighbor. He was their suspect. The profile of a recluse, the man was described as a loner in his late 50s. Thin, with hollow cheeks and darting eyes, he kept to himself. No close friends. No visitors. Just endless piles of junk. He didn't have steady work. Occasionally, neighbors spotted him rummaging through dumpsters, collecting scrap metal, or visiting yard sales with crumpled bills. He lived as though time had forgotten him. Yet there was something about him that made people uneasy. A heaviness in his stare, a bitterness in his muttered words. He was the kind of guy you didn't want to cross, one neighbor later said. Not because he was loud or violent, but because he gave you that feeling. Like he was keeping something dark inside. When police began digging into his past, the red flags multiplied. Petty theft charges. Trespassing incidents. Complaints about strange odors coming from his house, going back years. A history of mental instability that had been quietly noted but never aggressively followed up. And now, with a body behind his wall, all of those fragments painted a chilling picture. The suspect wasn't home when the woman's body was discovered. But police tracked him down within hours, locating him wandering on the outskirts of Vallejo. Witnesses said he looked dazed, muttering to himself, unaware that his world was about to collapse. The arrest was swift. Handcuffs snapped around his wrists as officers read his rights. Crowds gathered, some shouting angrily, others staring in shock. For years, they had tiptoed past his house, uneasy but dismissive. Now, they saw their worst fears confirmed. News cameras captured the moment he was led away. His face blank, almost resigned, as though he knew the lies he had built inside his house were finally crumbling. Inside the interrogation room at the Vallejo Police Department, the suspect sat in a sterile room. A table, 2 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner. He hunched over, hands cuffed, eyes fixed on the floor. Detectives entered, their tone calm but firm. They didn't start with accusations. Instead, they asked questions. When was the last time you saw her? Did she ever come to your house? Why was there a false wall in your living room? The suspect's answers were fragmented. Denials at first, then confusion, then silence. But the evidence was overwhelming. The false wall, the body, the stench, the timeline that placed the woman in contact with him before her disappearance. Every thread pulled tighter around him. At one point, detectives slid photographs across the table, images of the false wall being torn down, of the chamber where she was found. The suspect flinched, his mask cracking. "You think people wouldn't notice," one detective said quietly. "But secrets have a way of coming out. Even the walls couldn't keep yours hidden." Still, he refused to confess. His silence, however, spoke volumes. The media frenzy as word spread, the case became a headline sensation. Woman found behind wall in Vallejo Hoarder house. Suspect arrested in gruesome discovery. Cable news ran 24-hour coverage. Crime podcasts speculated endlessly. Social media erupted with theories. Some focused on the horror of the hoarder lifestyle, how isolation and obsession could spiral into madness. Others zeroed in on the victim, demanding justice for the young woman whose life had been stolen. Vigils were held in Berkeley, where she had last been seen alive. Her family, devastated but determined, stood before microphones, tears streaming as they called for accountability. She was loved, her sister said. She was more than a headline, more than a victim. We won't let her story be reduced to the horror of how she was found. She deserves justice. A community shaken in Vallejo, neighbors were haunted by guilt. They had seen the signs, the smells, the strange behavior, the walls of clutter, but had dismissed them as quirks of a reclusive man. Now, they wondered, could this have been stopped sooner? Some admitted they had always suspected something was wrong. It wasn't just hoarding, one woman said. It felt darker. But what do you do? Call the police because your neighbor's house smells? We didn't know it was this. The discovery forced hard questions about how communities overlook warning signs, how isolation can mask danger, and how the line between eccentricity and menace can blur until it's too late. The legal battle begins. The suspect's arrest was only the beginning. Prosecutors prepared charges of first-degree murder, unlawful concealment of a body, and evidence tampering. His defense team hinted at mental illness, suggesting he wasn't fully aware of his actions. But prosecutors countered with the deliberate construction of the false wall, calling it calculated concealment. This was not the act of a man unaware, the prosecutor declared at the arraignment. This was the act of a man who knew what he had done and who tried to bury it, literally, behind his own walls. The courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled notes. The victim's family sat in silence, clutching each other's hands. When the suspect entered, shackled and escorted by guards, the room fell into tense quiet. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. The judge read the charges aloud. His plea, not guilty. Gasps rippled through the room. The trial was set. And with it, the stage for a battle that would test the system, the community, and the family's resolve for justice. The case had gone from mystery to tragedy, and now to a fight for accountability. But for the family, no verdict could erase the horror of what they had learned, that their loved one had been hidden away, erased from the world, by a man who thought his walls could keep his secret forever. The courthouse in Vallejo had never seen so much attention. Reporters filled the steps, their cameras waiting to capture every moment. Families who had never known the victim or the accused came just to be present, to witness what felt like a once-in-a-generation case. Inside, the atmosphere was charged, the kind of quiet tension where every sound seemed louder than it should have. The shuffle of papers, the creak of wooden benches, the low whispers of speculation. The suspect was escorted in by deputies, his wrists chained at the waist. He looked thinner than when he had been first arrested, his hair more unkempt, his eyes even more hollow. He didn't look at anyone as he sat down next to his defense attorney, who leaned toward him, whispering strategy. Across the aisle sat the victim's family, their faces pale but steady. They had vowed to see this process through, no matter how long or painful it might be. The prosecutor stood, her voice firm as she laid out the charges. First-degree murder. Unlawful concealment of a body. Evidence tampering. Every word echoed in the silent courtroom. She spoke not only of the crime itself, but of the cruelty it represented. The victim had been more than just a statistic, more than just another face on the news. She had been a sister, a daughter, a friend. She had dreams, and all of them were shattered behind a false wall in a house filled with garbage. The defense tried to paint a different picture. Their strategy was to lean heavily on mental illness, to argue that the suspect wasn't a calculating killer, but a broken man living in a broken world. They spoke about his years of isolation, his untreated psychological issues, his inability to connect with others. He lived in a prison of his own making, the defense attorney argued, a prison of walls and clutter and sickness. They wanted the jury to see him as a man who didn't know what he was doing, a man who couldn't control his actions. But the prosecution countered with cold, hard facts. A false wall didn't build itself. Concealment wasn't an accident. They showed photographs of the house, the painstaking construction of the hidden chamber, the care that had gone into making sure no one would find what was behind it. That, they argued, was proof of intent. Proof of guilt. Witnesses were called one by one. Neighbors took the stand, recounting the strange smells, the unsettling behavior, the way the suspect would glare at children playing in the street. Some admitted they had long suspected something was wrong but had brushed it off as eccentricity. Their guilt was heavy, their voices breaking as they testified. One neighbor, a middle-aged woman who lived across the street, described how she would see the victim pass by the house on her way home. "I think about it every day," she said, tears streaming. "How close she was to me. How I never knew what was happening just a few doors away." The victim's family gave testimony that was even more wrenching. Her sister described the frantic days after she disappeared, the sleepless nights, the endless fear. Her parents sat beside her, clutching tissues, nodding along as their daughter spoke. "She was more than a headline," her sister said firmly. "She was a light in our lives, and he tried to bury that light in the dark. But here we are, bringing her story into the open where it belongs." The defense tried to chip away at the narrative. They questioned the reliability of memories, the assumptions neighbors had made, the possibility of contamination in the evidence collected from such a chaotic house. They hinted at alternative explanations, but every attempt fell flat against the weight of the evidence. The jury listened intently, their faces tight, their bodies leaning forward. They weren't just absorbing facts, they were absorbing a story, a narrative of betrayal and concealment that had shaken an entire community. Then came the forensic experts. They described the false wall in detail, how it had been carefully measured, nailed into place, painted over to blend in with the rest of the filthy room. They explained how the body had been discovered, the way the air itself had changed when the wall was broken down. The scientific precision of their words left no room for doubt. This had been intentional. This had been deliberate. The defense cross-examined, pressing the experts on minor inconsistencies, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the photographs. They had heard the testimony. They had felt the weight of the family's grief. As the days wore on, the case became not just about one man and one crime, but about the nature of secrecy and denial. How much do we ignore in our communities? How many warning signs do we brush off because we don't want to believe something darker is happening? The prosecution reminded the jury of this in their closing remarks. "This wasn't just a tragedy," the prosecutor said, her voice steady but sharp. It was a failure of vigilance. But now, in this courtroom, we have a chance to correct that failure. To deliver justice. To say that her life mattered. The defense made their final plea, speaking again of mental illness, of broken systems that had failed the suspect as well. They asked the jury for mercy, for understanding. But mercy is a difficult thing to grant when the evidence of intent is staring you in the face. The jury was instructed, and the courtroom emptied. Outside, crowds waited, chanting, holding candles, praying for justice. The victim's family returned to their hotel, clutching each other's hands, bracing for the outcome. Inside the courthouse, 12 strangers sat in a room, their task clear but heavy. They carried not just the weight of evidence, but the weight of a community, a family, and a story that had captured the attention of the nation. They would deliberate for hours, perhaps days. But one thing was certain: the truth, once hidden behind a false wall, was now in the open. And the question remained, would justice finally break through, or would the suspect's final defense be enough to cloud what seemed so clear? The jury deliberations began on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Vallejo hadn't seen weather like it in weeks, as though the skies themselves had chosen this moment to weep. Inside the courthouse, tension hung thick in the air. Every hour felt like a lifetime. Reporters crowded outside, refreshing their feeds, waiting for any hint of news. Families of both the victim and the suspect paced, prayed, and stared silently into the storm. Inside the jury room, 12 men and women sat in a circle, files spread across the table. They weren't strangers anymore. They had lived through weeks of testimony together. They had seen the photographs, heard the tears of the victim's family, listened to the defense's desperate pleas. Now, they carried the burden of deciding a man's fate. The first votes were taken quickly, almost instinctively. Most leaned toward guilt, but one or two hesitated. They wanted to go back over the evidence, to re-examine the testimony. They didn't want to rush, because the stakes were too high. A life had been lost, and another life was in their hands. Hour after hour, they revisited details. Could the false wall really be explained by anything other than concealment? Could mental illness account for such careful construction? Was there any reasonable doubt left in the case? Slowly, the doubts shrank. The arguments faded. The weight of what they had seen and heard pressed down on them. By the following morning, the jury was unanimous. Word spread quickly. Reporters shouted into microphones, announcing that the jury had reached a verdict. Crowds swelled outside, umbrellas dotting the courthouse steps. The victim's family arrived, pale and trembling, holding each other for strength. The suspect was escorted in, chains clinking, his face blank. He looked older than he had just weeks before, as though the trial had aged him by years. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. The foreperson stood, holding a piece of paper that felt heavier than anything they had ever carried. The judge asked the question, and the answer came in a steady voice. Guilty on all counts. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps. Cries. The victim's mother collapsed into her daughter's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Her father sat rigid, eyes brimming but unblinking, as if he couldn't allow himself to break in front of everyone. The prosecutor closed her eyes for a moment, a quiet exhale of relief passing through her. The defense attorney's shoulders slumped, their last hope extinguished. The suspect didn't flinch. He didn't protest. He simply stared at the floor, as though the verdict was something he had already known would come. For the first time, he looked truly small, swallowed by the reality of what he had done. Sentencing was scheduled weeks later, but the verdict itself was enough to bring a wave of release to the community. For months, people had lived with fear, with suspicion, with grief. Now, at least, there was clarity. Justice, in some form, had been served. But justice is never perfect. It cannot undo the loss. It cannot bring back the laughter of the young woman who had been stolen away. Her family knew this, and yet they also knew that accountability mattered. It was the only thing left to grasp when everything else had been taken. When sentencing finally came, the courtroom was once again packed. The judge, solemn and steady, recounted the crimes, the evidence, the jury's decision. Then came the final words, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The victim's family wept openly, some with grief, some with relief. The suspect stood motionless, shackles clinking as deputies prepared to escort him away for the last time. His eyes never met the family's. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he wouldn't. Either way, the moment passed, and he was led from the courtroom, disappearing into the system that would hold him for the rest of his life. Outside, the community gathered. Candles were lit. Photos of the victim were held high, her smile shining in the night. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear now spoke loudly of resilience, of the importance of vigilance, of never again ignoring the signs that something might be wrong behind closed doors. The case left scars. Children in the neighborhood had nightmares about the house with the hidden wall. Adults struggled with guilt, replaying moments when they might have spoken up but didn't. But in time, the scars became reminders that darkness can hide in plain sight and that communities must stand together to protect their most vulnerable. For the victim's family, healing was a long road. They returned to Berkeley, carrying both grief and gratitude. They told her story whenever they could, determined that her life would not be reduced to how it ended. She had loved art, they reminded people. She had loved music, coffee shops, and long walks under California skies. She had mattered, and she still mattered. In the months that followed, the Hoarder house was demolished. Piece by piece, the structure came down until nothing remained but an empty lot. Neighbors gathered to watch, some cheering, some crying. It was more than just the destruction of a house. It was the destruction of a symbol, the tearing down of walls that had hidden too much pain. Where the house once stood, grass slowly began to grow. The space became a quiet reminder, a scar on the landscape, but also a place of rebirth. Flowers were planted in memory of the victim. For those who walked past, it became a place to stop, reflect, and remember that vigilance and compassion can sometimes be the only barriers between safety and tragedy. The story spread far beyond Vallejo and Berkeley. Documentaries were made, articles written, podcasts recorded. People across the country heard about the hidden wall, the missing woman, the family that refused to give up. It became a cautionary tale, yes, but also a story of resilience, of a community facing its darkest hour and finding the strength to demand justice. And in the end, though no verdict or sentence could bring the victim back, her family found solace in one truth: she had not been forgotten. Her story had been pulled from the shadows into the light. And in that light, she lived on. The weeks after the sentencing were strangely quiet in Vallejo. For a town that had been the center of so much noise, cameras, reporters, candlelight vigils, the sudden silence felt almost unsettling. The house was gone, the trial was over, the suspect locked away. But the echoes of what had happened lingered, woven into the streets, the conversations, the memories of everyone who had lived through it. For the victim's family, the quiet was harder than the noise. They no longer had reporters at their door, no longer had court hearings to attend. There was no longer a battle to fight in the public eye. What remained was the empty chair at the dinner table, the phone that would never ring with her voice again. Grief has a way of slipping in during silence, and the silence was deafening. Yet they also found strength in how many people had rallied around them. Strangers sent letters, neighbors dropped off meals, community groups created scholarships in her name. In every small gesture, they saw proof that she mattered, that her story had changed lives far beyond their own circle. The community also wrestled with its conscience. People asked themselves hard questions. How many warning signs had been ignored? How much responsibility did they carry for brushing off what was happening in that hoarder house? Many admitted to feeling guilt, even shame, for not speaking up sooner. But rather than letting the guilt fester, some residents channeled it into action. They formed neighborhood watch groups. They volunteered for local crisis hotlines. They made sure to check in on people who lived alone. Vallejo, in its own quiet way, became more vigilant, more compassionate. Across the country, the story didn't fade. National outlets picked it up again and again, framing it as one of the most bizarre and tragic true crime cases of recent years. Podcasts dissected it. Documentaries retold it, their somber narrators drawing millions of listeners into the horror of a false wall hiding a human life. For many, the case was a chilling reminder that, even in quiet suburbs, darkness can fester behind closed doors. It wasn't just about a single crime. It was about what happens when isolation, secrecy, and denial collide. The suspect's name became infamous, but his infamy didn't outshine the memory of the woman he had taken. Her friends and family made sure of that. They launched a foundation in her honor, focused on supporting families of missing persons and advocating for stronger checks on mental health interventions. She will not be remembered as a victim, her sister said during one fundraiser. She will be remembered as a light, as someone who inspired change, even in her absence. Meanwhile, in Vallejo, the empty lot where the Hoarder house once stood transformed into something unexpected. Neighbors planted flowers, set up a small bench, and created a community garden. It wasn't official. It wasn't planned. It simply grew out of a collective desire to reclaim the space, to turn tragedy into something healing. Children played nearby without fear for the first time in years. The smell of fresh soil replaced the stench that had once haunted the street. People walked past and paused, reflecting, sometimes leaving small tokens of remembrance. A necklace, a letter, a photograph. It became more than just a garden. It became a promise that the community would not forget, a promise that they would remain vigilant, a promise that they would honor the life that had been hidden and stolen. For those who told and retold the story, reporters, podcasters, YouTubers, it became an emblematic case of how secrets rot in silence. It showed how even ordinary places can harbor extraordinary horror, and how justice, though often slow, can still prevail. For viewers and listeners, it was both shocking and sobering. The victims' parents, in time, learned to live with the grief, though it never disappeared. They spoke at community events, encouraging people to notice the signs, to never assume that what looks like eccentricity might not hide something more dangerous. If your gut tells you something is wrong, speak up, her father said at one gathering. You could be the difference between life and death for someone. His words carried weight, because everyone in the room knew exactly what he meant. The story never became easier to hear. It never stopped being horrifying. But it became a kind of warning woven into the fabric of Vallejo's history. And in that warning, there was power. Power to prevent. Power to protect. Power to remember. The victim's face, once printed on missing posters, was now framed in murals, in scholarships, in the memories of thousands who had never met her but who would never forget her name. In the end, that was her family's triumph. Though the man who had hidden her behind his wall thought he could erase her, she was more visible, more remembered, more celebrated than he would ever be. And as for the suspect, his name faded over time. He became just another inmate, another number in the system, another reminder of how darkness consumes itself. He would live out his days in a cell, his walls now iron bars rather than wood and plaster. He could no longer hide anything. Vallejo moved forward. Berkeley moved forward. The family, slowly, painfully, moved forward. But no one forgot. The story lived on, not just as a chilling true crime tale, but as a testament to resilience, vigilance, and the simple truth that even the darkest secrets cannot remain hidden forever.